Despite what it may look like, this is indeed the next episode of the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. If you're unfortunate enough to be entering this series on this video, I'll leave a link in the description to the playlist containing previous videos. You're going to want to watch those because they'll contain the context necessary to really understand what's going on in this one. Now, the reason why I'm showing a game that is not played by Emanuel Lasker in a series about Emanuel Lasker is because this game affords me a unique opportunity to explain the format of this tournament, something I've not really felt the need to explain beforehand, but is very crucial to understanding the importance of this game. The time control of this tournament was 20 moves an hour, which was very standard for the time, but a somewhat unique feature is that 3 games had to be played every 2 days. Now what this means is that there would be a morning session and an evening session of 4 hours each. So let's say round 1 would be played in the morning session, round 2 would be played in the evening, and then on the following day, round 3 would be played in the morning, and round 4 would be reserved for adjourned games. If games went on longer than their respective session, the turn player, rather than making a move, would seal it inside of an envelope, and then that move would be tucked away until the game would be replayed, the move would be put on the board, and the players would continue. This isn't something I felt the need to bring up beforehand because, to the best of my knowledge, the games we have shown were all played in one session. Most of them were under 40 moves, and the ones that went a little bit over were ended, I assume, quickly enough that they didn't feel the need to adjourn it. But this game is somewhat unique in that it was adjourned twice. Now, why is that important? In the previous video, we took a look at round 6, where Emil von Feyerfeil, playing white, defeated Emanuel Lasker. And in round number 7, which was not recorded unfortunately, Lasker lost a second game, this time to Adolf Stief. So at the end of the tournament, he was sitting on 4 out of 6. Now at the same time, von Feyerfeil was sitting on 4 out of 5, and the reason why he had not played his 6th game is because of this game. His game against Paul Lipke was slated for round number 4, but it was adjourned twice, and was therefore the last game in the tournament to finish. And so this game is very important for the tournament results, first of all, but it also features a very unique incident, which is worth showing the game simply on that merit alone. Now, because this is not a Lasker game, and because it is the longest game of the series by far, I'm not going to be covering it in as great a detail as I would perhaps for a Lasker game, but I do feel the need to cover this game because it is just absolutely insane what happens. So without further ado, von Feyerfeil with white opens with e4, and in this game Lipke plays the French defense. d4, d5, knight to c3, knight to f6, and now Feyerfeil decides to advance the pawn to e5. We have knight f to d7, and now knight c to e2. f4 is the main move here, although Feyerfeil's move is sensible enough, planning to meet the c5 advance with c3. Knight to c6, and only now f4. Queen to b6, and now knight to f3, providing additional defense to the d4 pawn. Now, interestingly, this position is one that frequently arises from a Tarrasch French move order, with white's knight going via d2 to f3 and the king's knight going to e2. The Tarrasch French wouldn't be introduced until the late 1890s, or maybe the early 1890s, I'm not super sure. Regardless, the framework for it was introduced beforehand, so you can understand where it was coming from. Here Lipke plays f6, attacking the strong pawn chain, and now a3, preventing any eventual bishop to b4 ideas, and preparing b2 to b4 himself. So bishop to e7, and now knight to g3, opening up the bishop. After black castles, we have bishop to d3. C captures on d4, C captures on d4, and now Lipke really asks Feyerfeil an important question when he plays f captures on e5. The decision of how to recapture on e5 is a very important one. Knight captures on e5 is doubtlessly the worst, because after knight captures on e5, either one of these and d captures on e5, knight captures on e5 simply wins a pawn. You can't take this because of a checkmate here on f2. Black is up a pawn, no further questions to ask. Objectively speaking, the best way to capture is d captures on e5, but this has almost never been played, something between like 10 to 20% of all games. It makes sense when you think about it intuitively. White is capturing away from the center. You're freeing up the queen's diagonal. You're opening up the c5 square for any number of black minor pieces. Optically, it looks horrible. So f captures on e5 intuitively makes the most sense, but now white has to grapple with a very dangerous black move. Rook captures on f3. Now, believe it or not, this move has been played before, not just in our time, but before this game. This somewhat controversial exchange sacrifice was introduced at the 1877 Leipzig tournament by the legendary German master Louis Paulsen. Now, the authors at the time called this move incorrect, and the tournament book in particular gives the moves rook to f7 followed by knight to f8, as the preferred alternative, though of course the positional exchange sacrifice wasn't something that they really valued back then, so this shouldn't come as much of a surprise. Now for some further trivia, queen captures on f3 was played in that original Paulsen game. The white pieces were played by Emil Schalep. After queen captures on d4, the problem is that the e5 pawn is simply falling. There's no way to defend it enough times. So after knight to e2, you could simply capture here on e5 with the queen, but Paulsen found the much more correct queen to h4 with check. And after g3, knight d captures on e5, attacking the queen and hitting the bishop. You obviously don't want to drop this with check. So queen to e3, and after this trade here on d3, knight d3, queen d3, Louis Paulsen dropped his queen back to f6, and he would go on to win this game as black. The white king is stuck in the center. There are absolutely no pawns guarding it. There are central pawns of black storming towards the black king. I don't think I need to tell you how this game ended. Now, it was said back then that the preferred move was g captures on f3, and that was what von Feyerfeil played here. The idea being that after queen captures on d4, you can defend the e5 pawn through f4. Fair enough. There was one other game that had reached this position before this one. Bishop to c5 was played in an 1879 game between Ernst Flechsig and Arnold Schottlander. But here, knight to c5 was instead played by Lipke. This comes with a double attack on the bishop, which drops back to c2. And now, strictly speaking, the best development plan is to start with b6. And then, for example, I found a game with rook to b1 and now bishop to a6. This was played in a 2001 game, and black went on to win this position. Lipke instead played the move bishop to d7, and so it is as of move 16 that the players are playing a unique game, relatively late for our standards. Despite being material up, von Feyerfeil avoids the queen exchange for now, queen to e2, and now knight to a5. If knight to b3 comes, then the b2 pawn could come under quite a bit of fire, so rook to b1 from Feyerfeil, and indeed after knight a to b3, the bishop is free to go to e3, now that the pawn is defended. So queen to c4, and now the queen exchange is fine. Queen captures on c4 and d captures on c4. Now is the last time that white is able to castle, and I think it's worth looking at. Here white is threatening f5, which would make black's life very uncomfortable. And after g6, here knight to e4 comes. There are a whole bunch of outposts that the knight would like to jump to. Here black could trade knight e4 and bishop e4. With the queenside pawns being under attack like this, the best way to hold on to them both is simply to play knight to c5. This also comes with an attack on the bishop, but the bishop simply drops back to f3. And I think black is going to struggle to show compensation for the exchange here. Yes, the queenside pawn majority is going to be very dangerous, but it'll probably take some time to mobilize, given that this pawn is currently unable to move, and you're going to be struggling here as black. I don't think that there's full compensation for the exchange in this particular variation. Feyerfeil instead goes for rook to d1. This move is fine as well, and indeed it's the engine's top choice, but it's very committal, because now Lipke is able to play bishop to c6, kick the rook, and now the white king is stuck in the center. So, with the rook here on f1, the f5 thrust is still up in the air, so Lipke again plays g6, and now Feyerfeil makes use of his king to e2. We have knight to a4 going after the b pawn, so the rook is forced back to b1, and commentators declared that rook to d1 was something of a waste of time because the rook had to go back to b1. The concrete lines are, again, beyond the scope of this video because I don't want this to take too long, but just know that rook to d1 was a perfectly reasonable move to begin with. The knight b drops back to c5, and now bishop to d4. Feyerfeil improves his bishop, rook to d8, and here king to e3. This is the kind of king activity that the current world champion Wilhelm Steinitz would be proud of. Now, unfortunately, it's not super long-lasting because here Lipke plays knight to b6, and after knight to e2, this knight comes to d5 with check. The king gets kicked back to d2, and now here comes b5 from Lipke. We shouldn't forget that he also has resources. We've been spending this time talking about all of white's attacking chances, but black is the one who sacrificed the exchange, and he does have quite a bit of compensation in his queenside pawn majority, and especially the c pawn. It's also worth noting that the exchange doesn't do too much for white at the moment, given that these rooks so far have simply been defending pawns. I do want to point out here that the tournament book suggests pushing a5 instead, though their justification is tactically unsound. Now their idea here is to play after b4, you can take everything here on b4, a captures b4, a captures b4, knight captures on b4. The idea being that after rook captures on b4, knight to e4 with check, bishop captures e4, and bishop captures on b4 with check. Now they end here with white playing king to c1 and dropping the bishop here on e4. What they somehow missed is king to e3 protects both of the bishops, and white simply comes out ahead a knight for 2 pawns. Now this particular variation doesn't work, but of course it's important to note that there are these sorts of tactics up in the air, and so there's a lot of calculation to do. Lipke's eventual choice of pawn to b5 is completely reasonable. Feyerfeil pushes b4 anyways, and now en passant is forced. C captures on b3 en passant, bishop captures on b3, and only now a5. The queenside pawn storm is coming. How do you deal with this as von Feyerfeil? He decides to give up his bishop here. Bishop captures on d5. And again, we have a position where deciding exactly how to recapture is quite difficult. E captures on d5 can be ruled out right away. After bishop captures c5, bishop captures c5, rook f to c1, wins a piece. Simple as that. Bishop captures on d5 looks to be wrong initially because of rook captures on b5, simply giving up a pawn. But here you see after knight to b3 with check, the king moves to c2, and now there's a very quiet move black has to play a4, cementing this knight. Here white doesn't have a good way to meet the dual threats of bishop to c4 or bishop to e4, except for giving back the exchange. So after rook captures on d5, again you have a choice to make which way you want to recapture. The most concrete line I could find was after rook captures on d5. Here the bishop has to move back to e3, and following bishop captures on a3, now the knight gets to come to c3. You fork the rook and the pawn. White's going to pick back up the pawn, and we're going to have a dead drawn endgame. Here Lipke takes the third way. Rook captures on d5. And the problem with this is that Feyerfeil's king is able to return to e3, and now knight to c3 is a very difficult threat to meet that would win a pawn for white, and suddenly Lipke would have no compensation for the exchange. So knight to a4, defending the c3 square, but here we have rook f to c1. The bishop gets kicked back to d7, and now he takes a second to defend his pawn with rook to b3. Lipke gets rid of that with b4. We have a captures on b4, a captures on b4, and now a move that shows that Lipke's position has really gone awry somewhere, rook to c7. This is of course a huge problem. A rook on the 7th is always annoying, but given that black is still down the exchange, this is especially troublesome if he's trying to prove that the exchange, and therefore his minor piece, is at least as good as the rook. It clearly is not here. The knight drops back to c5, keeping everything protected and blunting the rook. The rook drops back to b1, and now bishop to f8. We have rook to a7, getting out of any potential knight to a6s, excuse me. Bishop to b5. And now we have a very important question that we have to ask. Can white take the pawn? If rook captures on b4, the most challenging move from black has to be knight to d7. The rook is attacked, and there are all sorts of tactics where potentially this knight could be taken. The king is somewhat overloaded, defending both of these minor pieces. The hand wants to play rook to b2, which would unburden the king. There are lines where if the bishop takes here, then the king would lose the defense of the bishop. But here the point is that after bishop captures on e2 and rook captures on e2, you would think that this piece is defended, and you're only half correct. Rook captures on d4 is still possible, because after king captures on d4, bishop to c5 comes with check. You fork the rook, and this is an endgame that only black can win. Thankfully here white has the very clever move rook to a8. This motif will come up again, so make sure to remember it. And after the king gets out of the way, somewhere king to f7, now you can play rook to b2. White is simply up in exchange for basically nothing. Now, Feyerfeil perhaps misses this rook to a8 move. He plays the move knight to c1. Now, if you go over this game with an engine, it will call this move a mistake. The only reason for that is that black has access to this move g5. This isn't played in the game, so we're not going to talk about it. Just keep that in mind if you go over this game yourself. Knight to d7 is played anyways, so we open up another defender of this pawn. Here comes rook to a8, and now king to g7. Now, as this is move number 40, the game could be adjourned either here or in the next few moves. I admit I don't know precisely when it happens, but this was around the point of the first adjournment, and it's important that it happens before a certain move coming up soon. You'll see what I mean. Rook to c8 from von Feyerfeil. We have bishop to e7, and now knight to a2, so adding a second attacker to this pawn, and only now does Lipke play the move g5. Now here Feyerfeil takes it, and I cannot understand why. Knight captures on b4 was the move that he wanted to play, and indeed after g captures on f4 with check, you don't retake this pawn, but rather king to e4. You got to keep an eye on this bishop. And after this trade here on b4, bishop captures b4 and rook captures on b4, the tournament book says that this was preferable in every respect, and I have to agree. Here after f captures on g5, bishop captures on g5 with check. The king is again going to e4. And now bishop to a6. You don't immediately have to respond to this attack. You can make your own threats against this potentially overextended rook. Rook to c7. and now the bishop drops back to d8. Now, what do you do with this rook? The tournament book gives the move rook c to c1, though they don't provide a response to what I would consider to be a very strong move, bishop to b6, which takes advantage of this bishop being unable to move due to bishop to d3 check. Perhaps the safest thing white could do here is bail out by playing rook captures on b4, and then after bishop captures on d4 and rook captures on d4, here we would have knight to c5 with check, and after king to e3 you don't trade the rooks here, but rather you take here on e5. Rook captures e5 with check, king to f4, king to f6 defending, and I think that ultimately this endgame should end up drawn. But here, Feyerfeil plays a move that he had earlier avoided, rook to a7. Now you perhaps remember what happened the last time a rook was on a7. The same motif happens here. Rook captures on d4 with check, king captures on d4, and bishop to b6 check, simply winning a piece for black. King e4, bishop captures on a7, and rook captures on b4 begins the endgame. Now this endgame should be losing for white. If the pawns were connected, then I would potentially say that this was in drawing territory, but because the pawns are separated and because there is an extra set of pieces on the board, I would say that this is much more winnable for black. Of course, the material is still somewhat reduced, so it can be hard to prove such things. But again, Feyerfeil would really, really not like to lose this game, so it's no wonder that the game goes on for as long as it does. We start with bishop to c5. The rook drops back to b2, and now bishop to a3, attacking the rook again. Rook to g2 with check, king to f7, rook to f2 with check, and king to e7, getting out of any further checks. Now we reach what I would perhaps consider the next critical position. What I want you to do is see if you can figure out what white played here. I'm not going to give you all that much time because unless you've seen this game before, I really do not think anyone is going to guess what the move is here. But in this position, Emil von Feyerfeil, with the white pieces, played the move rook to h2. Now indeed, you'll see that the overlay does not let me play the move, because it's an illegal move. Now, if you're doubting that this was actually the move played, here is the game score from the tournament book. You can see that a piece did indeed move from f2 to h2, and if there's anyone thinking that I transcribed the game wrong, here's the diagram on the next page, which is an exact copy of what we have on the screen right now. So what happened? When players are resetting a game that has been adjourned, it was fairly common practice in the day to simply set up the position for move 1 and simply play through the game again. The players were recording the moves, of course. This is a time-long tradition. But in this particular instance, the players decided to simply reset the board from memory. And it just so happened that neither of them realized that a pawn was missing from h2. So with a little bit of TV magic, we can simply erase that pawn from the board, and this was the position at white's 53rd move. Now it's interesting, there are conditions in the tournament book where if either player realizes that a position has been set up incorrectly, they can demand that the game be started over, but neither player recognized that the pawn was missing. So from now on, there is no pawn on h2, and Emil von Feyerfeil is allowed to play the move rook to h2. Now, some commentators, of course, have said that with the pawn on h2, this endgame was trivially drawn, and so this missing pawn was the reason that the game went the way it did. Again, in my opinion, the endgame was losing either way, but it does make for a completely reasonable clickbaity title, which you've clicked on. So there we go. So rook to h2. The best move in the position, fair enough. Comes with an attack on the pawn. Lipke drops the knight back to f8 to defend it, and now king to d4. We have king over to f7, and now knight to c3. Rook to a2 would be something of a cold shower for Lipke, so he moves his bishop out of the way, bishop to c1. We have knight to e4, again poking at some of these nice outpost squares. King to g7, and now rook to a2, hitting the bishop. The bishop slides over to b5, and now rook to f2. We're going to be covering this a little bit faster now. Bishop back to e8, and now knight to f6, attacking the bishop, which goes over to g6, and now rook to g2. Pinning this is very effective, as now the pawn is unable to be pushed to h5. So king to h7 unpins, f7, excuse me, but now rook to a2. Now rook to a7 is a pretty big threat. Lipke's king is in some danger. For example, if he gets hasty and pushes h5 here. On rook to a7, the only move here is to block with the knight, and this endgame, I would say, is looking more like a draw. So bishop to f5 gives the king some much needed breathing room. We have king to c5 and now bishop to f4. So you got to make contact with the pawn. If black is able to win this pawn, then this endgame is easily winning. So rook to a7 with check, king to g6 as intended, and king to d6. So Feyerfeil has improved his king, but it's hard to tell if this actually does much for him or if it's really much of an improvement at all. The black e-pawn is more than sufficiently protected, and there is of course another pawn to worry about, h5. Now how do you stop this pawn from simply running down the board and making a new queen for black? Well, it is now Feyerfeil's turn to sacrifice the exchange, rook to g7 with check, practically forced. Now, it's actually in black's best interest to not take the exchange and instead go king to h6. The idea here that on rook to f7, which threatens to take the knight, bishop to c1. Now, if you take, bishop to a3 comes with check, skewers, and after you get the king out of the way, the bishop comes to a3 anyway, the knight is protected, and the pawn is free to roll down the board. Lipke took, which is still completely winning, but it does make the task a little bit harder because after knight captures on h5 with check, the bishop on f4 falls. Now again, still completely winning, though it's not immediately obvious how. Since white's pawn is on a dark square, black technically doesn't have enough attackers to take it directly. One potential route I could think of off the top of my head is that if black ever gets in a knight to f7 check, this would dislodge the king and you could potentially take here. It's not immediately clear when this will happen or if it will even win. There's a chance that the exchanges would lead to a drawn endgame, but with proper technique, this is winning for black. So let's see some 19th century endgame technique. King to g5. The knight gets punted back to e2, and now bishop to g4 kicks it again. The knight moves to d2, and now an important first step for Lipke, make contact with the pawn. King to f4. Okay, we have knight to c6 still defending, and now king to e4. This is always a nice little bit of geometry, get out of any potential knight checks. The knight slides back to d8, and now a waiting move, bishop to f5. Here comes king to e7 from Feyerfeil, kicking the knight. Now the knight is forced to an only square, but it's not that hard to find. Knight to g6 with check, king to f6, and now knight to f4, still defending the pawn. And here knight to f7, still defending the pawn. So both sides have reshuffled their forces, keeping the status quo. It's not immediately obvious if either of them have gained anything from this reshuffling. The tournament book was very optimistic for black, if Lipke had played the move knight to d5 with check. The idea being that after king to g7, bishop to g4. Now if bishop to h5 comes, then this knight simply falls and the pawn is lost. King to g6 prevents this, but now a cute little zugzwang-ish move, bishop to d1. Now, the inevitable can be delayed if white plays something like king to g5 and really prevents both this king from entering and the bishop from getting to h5. The book cuts to the chase and shows the ultimate result that at some point, if the king gets put offside, then king to f5 comes. Now the g6 square is taken away, and once the king goes back, bishop to h5 will eventually come, the knight will fall, the pawn will fall, game over. Lipke instead played king to d4, which doesn't lose him the game, but it's of course not as direct of a route. King to g5 and now knight to d5, so okay, you've taken away the f6 square all the same. King to h5 and now bishop to c2, king to g5 and bishop to h7, king to h5 when Feyerfeil is just waiting. If you're asking if there's anything wrong with the direct bishop to g8, the answer is no. Knight to h6 almost looks like it simplifies, but after king captures e5 and knight captures g8, black is very lucky to have knight to f6 with check, and if you know your king and pawn endgames, this evaluation should be obvious. But Lipke continues waiting. We have bishop to f5, king to h6, and now bishop to d3, king up to g7, and now bishop to c2. Now, it's again worth noting that we have here reached move number 80, which means that the game could have been adjourned for the second time anywhere past here. That's why this game is so crucial, as I mentioned earlier. If Feyerfeil draws this game, he would beat Lasker by half a point and win the Breslau 1889 Hauptturnier. The defense continues. King to h6, and now bishop to a4. The king goes up to g5, and now it's worth noting that in this position, the direct route does not work. If the bishop goes to e8, then now knight to d6 works, and because there's no check, you cannot take this pawn, so the bishop would actually be a liability on this square. So, king to e4, we're going back, king to g4, and now bishop to d1 with check, king to g5, and as a similar vein as the tournament book showed earlier, bishop to e2. Another beautiful, somewhat zugzwang move that puts us in the same territory where white's king doesn't have too many options. After king to g6, we have king to f4. So now the king is forced offside again, king to h6, and now king to f5. Now again, there's not too much that white can do to stop bishop to h5 from coming in. So here Feyerfeil goes for one last gambit. Knight to d8. Here the pawn was captured, and it is as of move 87, not that anyone resigned the game, but that the move stopped being recorded. Now, it's said in the tournament book that Lipke ultimately gave checkmate on move 121. So what I imagine happened was that here Feyerfeil took on e6, and after king captures e6, Feyerfeil just dared Lipke to give checkmate with bishop and knight. It's a very difficult checkmate to give, I'll give him that, but as the results show, Lipke did indeed give checkmate and ultimately won this game. So you can see the results on the overlay, but just to be more explicit, here is the final cross table. We see that Feyerfeil and Lasker tie for first place, and so the ultimate result of the Breslau 1889 Hauptturnier will be decided by a final tiebreak game, which I'll of course show in the next video. So I hope you enjoyed this one. This was much longer than even I intended it to be. The final game of this tournament will be shown in the next video, and then we'll be moving on to bigger and better things. So I look forward to seeing you there. Until then.